The rain had not stopped since the burial, and on the morning the will was read aloud in the long gallery at Wexcombe Hall. Eleanor Price stood at the back of the room with a tray of untouched tea, and learned that she had been left nothing. She had expected nothing. A housemaid did not appear in a baron's testament, and she had no claim on the gilt and the acreage and the rents that the solicitor now recited in his careful, colorless voice. Yet she stood very still as the names were spoken, because she had laid the old man's hands across his chest herself. 3 nights passed, when no one else in the house could bear to do it. The room was full of black crape and lowered eyes, and the small, dry sounds people make when they are waiting to be told they are rich. At the front, in the chair nearest the fire, sat the nephew, Mr. Crane, who had arrived from town the day after the death with a great deal of luggage and a face arranged into grief. To the household, Eleanor was only the girl who carried the trays. That was the whole of her, as far as the family was concerned, and she had long since stopped expecting it to be otherwise. What none of them knew, what she kept folded against the lining of her apron, where the seam had been let out to hide it, was that the late Baron Ashford had given her something in the last week of his life that no solicitor had seen. He had pressed it into her palm, with fingers gone thin as candle tapers, and told her to keep it until the day the house forgot itself. She had not understood him then. She was beginning to understand him now. Stay with me through this one, because the world is about to decide who Eleanor is, and the world is going to be wrong. If a quiet story told slowly is the kind you like, you know what to do. Then the solicitor turned the last page. The will gave Wexcombe Hall and its lands and its income entire to the nephew. There was a murmur, low and pleased, from the cluster of cousins by the window, and Mr. Huggin. Crane inclined his head as if accepting a compliment he had earned through long labor. The Baron's sister, the Dowager Lady Marjorie, sat rigid and violet and surveyed the room with the expression of a woman confirming that the furniture had been arranged to her satisfaction. She had managed this. Eleanor had watched her manage it for a fortnight. The soft, constant pressure of her voice in the sick room. The documents brought up the back stairs. The visitors turned away. The Dowager believed she had secured the estate for the only nephew worth securing it for. And she was not entirely wrong to believe it, for the law was on her side, and the paper was on her side, and the whole weight of the season's good opinion was on her side. She had simply forgotten that a dying man may speak to the person who empties his basin. The other man in the room said nothing at all. He stood near the tall windows with a gray light behind him, and he had not moved through the entire reading, and Eleanor had been aware of exactly where he stood from the moment she entered, the way one is aware of a draught or a fire. The Duke of Harrogate had come because the Baron had been his godfather, and for no other reason that anyone could name. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair cut close and a jaw that held its line like something carved and left to weather. People did not approach him. He had a reputation for cold that arrived in a room before he did, and the cousins by the window had already glanced at him twice and thought better of speaking. He was watching the nephew accept the estate, and something in the set of his mouth suggested he found the performance wanting. Lady Marjorie rose when the reading was done. She crossed to her nephew and laid a gloved hand on his sleeve, and as she passed the tea tray she said, not quite under her breath, to the cousin beside her, "Someone remove the girl. We have no further need of the help today." But the cousin laughed, the small laugh of agreement. Eleanor lowered her eyes and turned to go, and the tray trembled once in her hands before she steadied it, and she hated that it had trembled because the Duke had seen. She did not know he had seen. She only felt the warmth climb her throat, the old betrayal of the body, and she carried the tray out through the service door with her back very straight. Behind her the gallery filled with the noise of people congratulating a man on a death. Eleanor had come to Wexcombe Hall 4 years before, when she was 22 and there was nowhere left to go. Her father had been a country clergyman with a good library and no money, and when he died the library was sold to pay what he owed. And Eleanor learned that an education in Latin and music and the management of a parish was worth precisely nothing in the open market unless it came attached to a dowry. She could read 4 languages. She could keep accounts cleaner than the steward. She took a position as a housemaid because a housemaid was fed, and she had been hungry. And hunger teaches a particular humility that does not leave even when the meals become regular. The wound the years had pressed into her was simple and total. She had decided that no one would ever again choose her for anything but her usefulness, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself was to stop wanting otherwise. The Baron had found her out within a month. He had come down to the library one night, unable to sleep, and discovered the new maid asleep over his copy of Cowper, and instead of dismissing her, he had sat down across the table and asked her what she thought of it. After that, there were many such nights. He was a lonely old man whose own children were dead, and whose nephew wrote only when money was wanted, and Eleanor became, without either of them naming it, the nearest thing he had to family in the last years of his life. She read to him when his eyes failed. She wrote his letters when his hand shook. She knew the names of the tenants and the histories of the quarrels and the place where the spring flooded the lower field. And she knew, because he had told her, that he had never trusted the nephew, and had been working at something in his final months that he would not explain. Now the old man was 3 days dead, and the something he had been working at was a folded paper sewn into the lining of an apron, and Eleanor did not yet know what it was. She had not dared to open it. He had told her to keep it until the day the house forgot itself, and she had a clergyman's daughter's superstition about instructions given by the dying, and so she carried it and waited and did not look. The dowager's campaign against her began in earnest the next morning. Lady Marjorie had decided, with the swift economy of a woman who disposes of obstacles, that Eleanor knew too much about the household to remain in it. The steward was instructed to find fault. The cook was instructed to report insolence. Eleanor watched the machinery assemble itself around her and understood that she would be turned out before the month was done, without a character, which in her world was the same as being turned out to die. She had £3 saved. She had a folded paper she could not read. She had, she told herself, no reason at all to be calm. And yet she found she was calm, the way water is calm under ice. The Duke of Harrogate did not leave Wexcombe Hall when the other mourners left. He sent for his men and his horses, and then he did not go, and he gave as his reason that the Baron's affairs wanted a friend's eye before he could in conscience depart. Lady Marjorie received this with cold courtesy, and a great deal of private irritation, because a duke could not be turned out of a house the way a maid could, and his presence was a stone in her shoe she could neither remove nor acknowledge. He took rooms in the east wing. He walked the grounds in the grey mornings. And on the third such morning he came upon Eleanor in the lower field, where the spring had flooded as it always flooded, kneeling in the wet grass beside a tenant's child who had fallen and cut his hand on the stones. He stopped at the edge of the field and did not announce himself. Eleanor had not heard him. She was speaking to the boy in a low, steady voice, tearing a strip from her own petticoat to bind the hand, telling him a foolish story about a frog who would not learn to swim. And the boy had stopped crying and started laughing, and the whole scene held a kind of unhurried competence that did not know it was being observed. When she had bound the hand and sent the child home, she stood and saw the Duke at the field's edge, and went still. "Your Grace," she said, dropped the curtsy that her station required. "You tore your own dress," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and level, and it gave nothing away. "It will mend," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he said, "Walk back to the house. The ground is not safe here." And he turned and went, and it was a command, flatly issued, and she received it as coldness and walked back to the house with her chin up and her hands cold, and did not once suspect that the man had stood at the edge of a flooded field and forgotten, for the length of a torn petticoat, how to breathe. That was the first of them, the small, deniable things. Over the following days they accumulated in a manner Eleanor could not have catalogued, because she was not looking for a pattern she had no reason to expect. He asked the steward idly why the lower field was allowed to flood, and the steward did not know, and Eleanor, summoned to bring papers, answered the question without being asked, and the Duke listened to her answer with an attention he gave to no one else in the house. He came to the library in the evenings, ostensibly to read, and found her there returning the Baron's books to their shelves, and he did not send her away. He learned by some means that she took her supper alone in the still-room because the upper servants would not have a clergyman's daughter at their table, and the family would not have a maid at theirs. And the next evening, a tray came to the still-room with meat on it, sent down from the Duke's own dinner, and no explanation given. She did not understand it. She decided he pitied her, and pity was a thing she had taught herself to refuse, and so she sent the meat back up untouched. With her thanks, and when she next passed him in the corridor, she saw something move across his face that she could not name, and that she told herself was displeasure. It was not displeasure. She was a woman who had built her survival on expecting nothing, and a woman like that does not easily read the language of a man who has built his survival on showing nothing. And so they passed each other in the corridors of a house that was being taken from under them both, each fluent in a silence the other could not translate. The Dowager noticed before either of them did. Lady Marjorie had spent 50 years reading rooms, and she saw the Duke's eyes follow the maid across the gallery one evening, and felt the floor of her certainty shift a quarter inch. It was not possible. It was not to be tolerated. She had a rival in mind for Harrogate already, had brought her to the house under the guise of comfort to the bereaved, a Miss Caroline Vane, the daughter of a viscount, 18 and lovely, and dressed in the ice blue that suited her, and the Dowager had arranged the dinner so that Miss Vane sat always at the Duke's right hand, that the Duke spoke to Miss Vane with perfect courtesy and perfect indifference, the Dowager chose not to see. That he had not once looked at her the way he had looked for half a second, at a maid kneeling in a flooded field, the Dowager could not afford to see. "She is a servant," Lady Marjorie said to her nephew that night, in the privacy of the small drawing-room, her voice low and final. "A clergyman's brat, who carries trays. Whatever she imagined she was to my brother, she is nothing now, and she will be gone within the week. See that Harrogate is kept occupied with the Vane girl. Mr. Crane, who wanted the Duke's good opinion for reasons of his own credit, agreed that it should be managed. It is worth pausing here because everything that follows turns on it. The household had decided what Eleanor was. The Duke had decided otherwise, and Eleanor herself had decided she would not hope. 3 verdicts, and only one of them true. The blow the Dowager had prepared fell at the dinner she had been building toward. The first proper dinner since the funeral, 30, at the long table and the good plate brought out, and Miss Vane at the Duke's right hand in ice blue silk. Eleanor was not meant to be in the room. She had been sent in at the last moment because a footman had taken ill and the table was short a pair of hands, and Lady Marjorie, seeing her enter with the wine, saw an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. As Eleanor leaned to fill the Dowager's glass, Lady Marjorie turned to Miss Vane and said, in the clear carrying voice of a woman who intends to be heard the length of the table, "Do you know, my dear, this one fancied herself my brother's confidant. A maid. They say she read to him. One wonders what else." And she let the insinuation hang, polished and poisonous, and the table caught its breath, and Miss Vane gave the small laugh that was expected of her. The wine did not so much as ripple in the glass. Eleanor finished pouring, set the bottle on the sideboard, and stood with her hands folded and her face composed, while 30 people decided in the space of a heartbeat that they had always suspected as much. Her heart was loud in her throat. The warmth climbed her neck. She did not move, and she did not speak, because there was nothing she could say that would not make it worse. And she had learned long ago that the only dignity available to her was the refusal to perform her own humiliation for an audience that had paid to watch. The Duke set down his glass. The small sound of it carried in the silence the Dowager had made. "Madam," he said to Lady Marjorie, and his voice was very quiet and very level, "you malign a woman who cannot answer you at your own table before your guests. I had thought better of this house." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Eleanor. He simply said it, flatly, as a man states a fact about the weather. And then he resumed his dinner, and the silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the silence before. and Lady Marjorie's hand was not quite steady as she lifted her own glass. Eleanor left the room when the course was cleared. In the dark of the corridor, she put her hand flat against the cold wall and stood for a moment, and she did not understand why her eyes stung, because no one had ever defended her before, and she did not have the practice of being defended, and her body did not know what to do with it. She told herself the Duke had spoken from breeding, not from regard. A gentleman corrected an incivility. It meant nothing. She pressed the folded paper through the lining of her apron with 2 fingers the way one touches a charm, and went down to the still room to be alone. That night she finally understood what the Baron had meant. The house had forgotten itself. It had stood at its own long table and degraded a dead man's friend for the entertainment of a viscount's daughter, and if that was not a house forgetting itself, then there was no such thing. She sat by the single candle in the still room, and she took out the folded paper, and she broke at last the small seal the Baron had pressed with his own ring, and she read what he had written, and the candle burned down a full inch, while she sat without moving. She did not sleep. By the gray of the morning she had resolved on the only course her conscience allowed, which was the most dangerous course available to a woman in her position, and she dressed, and she went up the back stairs, and she knocked at the door of the east wing where the Duke had his rooms. And when his man admitted her, she stood in the doorway with the paper in her hand, and her heart going like a struck bell, and she said, "Your Grace, I must show you something, and I do not know who else in this house can be trusted to read it." He was at the window in his shirt-sleeves, with the morning behind him, and he turned, and whatever was in his face when he saw her there, he put away before she could read it. He told his man to leave them and to close the door, and that single instruction told Eleanor more about the Duke's disregard for his own reputation than a year of dinners could have, for a Duke alone, with a maid behind a closed door, was a scandal in the making, and he had ordered it because the alternative was to make her speak her business in front of a servant, and he would not do that to her. "Sit," he said, and she sat, and he took the paper from her hand. The Baron had written it himself, in the failing hand Eleanor knew, and it was dated 9 days before his death, and it was witnessed. It was a second will. Not a codicil, not a wish, but a true testament, drawn in proper form with 2 witnesses who had since left the county, leaving the bulk of the estate not to the nephew but in trust, with provisions Eleanor could scarcely take in, and with one clause that the Duke read twice and then read aloud in a voice that had changed. The Baron had left to Eleanor the dower house and an income of £400 a year, in gratitude, the document said, for a kindness that his own blood had not thought to offer. And the will the solicitor had read in the long gallery, the will that gave everything to the nephew, was the older document. This was the newer. This was the true one. And it had been kept from the reading by someone who had known it existed and had wanted it not to. "Where did he give you this?" the Duke said. "In his bed, the night before he could no longer speak. He told me to keep it until the house forgot itself. I did not know what it was. I did not look until last night." The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then he said, not looking at her, "My godfather was a careful man. He would have left a copy with the men who witnessed it. He would not have trusted a single sheet to chance." He set the paper down with great care, as though it might bruise. "The Dowager has known. She turned away his visitors. In the last fortnight, she had the back stairs watched. She has been looking for this very thing, and finding only that it was gone, and she has been frightened, which is why she has been cruel." He turned to Eleanor then and looked at her directly, and his voice when he spoke again had dropped lower. "You came to me, you might have burned it. With this you are provided for, and to bring it into the light is to make an enemy of a woman who will not forgive you. Why did you come to me?" Eleanor met his eyes, and for once she did not lower hers. "Because it was not mine to burn," she said. "The dower house is a small thing. The estate is the tenants and the lower field and the families who have lived on this land for 100 years, and he did not leave it to a man who has never once asked their names. I could keep my £400 and let the rest go wrong. I find I cannot." She stopped, and then, because the morning had stripped something away from her, she added, "And because you are the only person in this house who has looked at me as though I were a person, I did not know whom else to trust. I am sorry if that is presumptuous." It was not presumptuous. The Duke stood very still, and something in his carved face came undone by a degree, and for a moment he was not a duke at all, but a man of 34 who had spent 8 years learning not to want anything, since the year he had wanted something and lost it. He had been married once. The whole county knew that much, and no more. What the county did not know, what he had told no living soul, was that his wife had died. Of a fever he had been too proud and too busy to take seriously until it was too late, and that her last clear words had been to ask him to come home from London, and that he had not come, and that he had spent the 8 years since in the cold discipline of a man who has decided that to feel is to be reckless, and to be reckless is to kill the thing you love. He carried her miniature in the breast of his coat. Eleanor had seen him touch the place 100 times and thought it a habit of grief, and not known it was an account being settled daily, a penance, a man pressing his thumb against the bruise to be certain it still hurt. He did not tell her any of this. He only said, "You are not presumptuous. You are correct." And he folded the will and put it inside his coat, against the place where the miniature lay, 2 papers now keeping each other company over his heart, and he said, "Leave this with me. Speak of it to no one. Go about your work as though nothing has changed, and let them believe you beaten. And trust me a little while longer than is comfortable for you. Can you do that?" "I have a great deal of practice at being thought beaten," Eleanor said, and for the first time in his presence she very nearly smiled, and the Duke saw the very nearly and felt it land somewhere under his ribs like a stone dropped in a still well. The week that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life. She carried trays. She endured the steward's manufactured faults and the cook's reported insolences and the dowager's cold satisfaction which had curdled since the dinner into something watchful and afraid. She did not know what the Duke was doing. He left the house twice on horseback and was gone whole days, and returned saying nothing, and she had to take it on faith, which was a currency she had spent so little of in her life that she hardly knew the weight of the coin. There was a night she nearly broke. She sat in the still room and thought how easy it would be to take her £400 and her dower house, and slip quietly out of the war she had chosen to enter, and let the tenants in the lower field and the 100 families fend as they could, and no one would ever blame her, for no one expected anything of a maid but that she looked to herself. She did not do it. In the morning, she carried the trays. The Duke was assembling his case the way his godfather would have wanted it assembled, which was to say, without a single weakness, the dowager's lawyers could pry at. He found the 2 witnesses, one removed to Bristol and one to a parish in Wales, and he brought their sworn statements back in writing. He engaged a solicitor of his own, a careful grey man named Mr. Felton, who examined the second will and the seal and the hand and the witnesses and pronounced it in the dry language of his profession entirely good, and he learned, by paying a footman, who had no love for Lady Marjorie, that the dowager had indeed known of the second will, had searched the Baron's papers for it in the days before his death, and had told the family solicitor to proceed with the older document on the strength of her assurance that no later one existed. That was the crack in her. That was the place where confidence became fraud. The dowager had not merely benefited from an oversight. She had asserted a falsehood to a court of probate, and a thing asserted can be disproved, and a woman who has asserted it can be ruined by the disproving. The Duke chose the ground for the reversal with care, and the ground he chose was the same long gallery where the first will had been read, and the occasion he chose was the formal dinner Lady Marjorie had planned to announce her nephew's possession of the estate to the county. 30 families invited, the vain girl to be displayed dal. The whole machinery of the season assembled to bless the theft. He let it be arranged. He let the invitations go out. He let Lady Marjorie believe she had won, because a verdict is only truly overturned in the place, and before the witnesses where it was first delivered, and he intended that every person who had watched the maid humiliated should watch the maid restored. On the morning of the dinner, Lady Marjorie sent for Eleanor and told her with great pleasure that her service at Wexcombe Hall was ended, that she would leave the following day without a character, and that she might consider herself fortunate not to be charged with theft. For several small things had gone missing from the late Baron's room, and the Dowager had her suspicions. It was the third time the verdict had been spoken over Eleanor, and it was spoken now as a third-party sentence, a thing decided and reported rather than argued, and it was meant to break her on the last morning so that she would be gone before the dinner, and the triumph complete. "Are a maid," Lady Marjorie said, drawing on her gloves, not troubling to look up. "You were always only a maid. Whatever my brother lets you imagine, it dies with him. Be gone by noon tomorrow." Eleanor curtsied and said nothing, and went down to the still-room, and her hands shook, and she let them because there was no one to see, and then she washed her face and put on the one good dark dress she owned and waited for the evening, because the Duke had asked her to trust him a little longer than was comfortable, and she had decided, against the whole instruction of her life, to do it. The dinner assembled in candlelight. 30 families in their best, the long table laid with a good plate, the orchestra of 2 violins and a cello playing low in the gallery, Miss Vane in fresh ice blue at the place of honor, Mr. Crane at the head of the table where the Baron had sat, Lady Marjorie in violet and diamonds surveying her arrangement with the calm of a general who has already won the field. Eleanor stood against the wall with the other servants in her dark dress, holding nothing, which was itself a small strangeness no one had time to remark. The Duke arrived last, as was his privilege, and he was dressed with a severity that drew the eye, all dark blue and white linen, and he did not take his seat. He stood at the foot of the table with a folded paper in his hand, and the grey solicitor, Mr. Felton, at his shoulder. And the room began, slowly, to understand that something was about to happen that had not been on the Dowager's program. "Forgive me," the Duke said into the lowering quiet, "for I will not keep you long from your dinner. There is a matter of law that touches this house, and it is better spoken here, before friends, than left to the cold rooms of a court." He let that settle. Lady Marjorie had gone very still in her violet. "My godfather," the Duke continued, "made a will in the last month of his life, drawn in proper form and properly witnessed, later than the one read in this room a fortnight past. I have the witnesses' sworn statements. I have the examination of counsel. The document is good." He laid it on the table. "It leaves the estate in trust, with the tenants provided for as he wished, and it makes provision, in gratitude, for the one person in this house who served him with love and asked for nothing." Now he looked, for the first time, down the length of the room to where Eleanor stood against the wall, and 30 faces turned to follow his look, and Eleanor stood in the candlelight, with her chin up, and her heart breaking quietly against her ribs. Lady Marjorie rose. Her voice, when it came, had lost its polish. "This is a forgery. Some scheme of the girl's." She read to him. She had the run of his papers. She could have. She stopped, because she heard too late that she had just placed herself inside the room where the document was made, and the grey solicitor, Mr. Felton, made a small note with his pencil, and the Dowager's hand went to her throat. The Duke did not raise his voice. He crossed the room. He crossed it in the long, unhurried strides of a man who has decided where he is going, past the vain girl in her ice blue, past the nephew half risen from the Baron's chair, past the Dowager with her hand at her throat, the whole gallery turning as he passed like a field of wheat under wind, and he stopped before Eleanor Price against the wall. And in the silence that the candlelight and the stilled violins had made enormous, he held out his hand to her. "Marry me," he said. "Then no one calls you maid again." The room did not breathe. Eleanor looked at the hand, and then up at the carved face above it, that was not carved at all now, that was open, that was frightened. That was a man of 34 asking for the one thing he had spent 8 years forbidding himself, and she understood at last, in a rush that took the strength from her knees, that not one of the small deniable things had been pity. She put her hand in his. It was the only answer the moment allowed, and it was the whole of her answer. And the Duke closed his fingers around her cold hand as though he had been given back something he had buried. And somewhere along the wall an old housekeeper named Mrs. Bell, Good, who had known Eleanor 4 years and loved her in the gruff way of her kind, pressed her apron to her mouth and made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. Lady Marjorie sat down. She did it slowly, the diamonds catching the candlelight as she lowered herself. And she did not speak again, because there was nothing left in her script for this. And the script had worked everywhere in 50 years except in this one room on this one night. Miss Vane looked from the Duke to the maid and back, and being not a cruel girl, only a managed one, she gave the smallest nod, as one acknowledges a hand well played, and turned her attention with relief to her soup, freed at a stroke from a marriage she had never been asked whether she wanted. Mr. Crane stood at the head of the table he would not keep, and discovered that the cousins by the window were no longer looking at him at all. The grey solicitor folded his papers. The thing was done, and it had been done in law and in daylight and before the very witnesses who had delivered the first verdict, and it could not be undone. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church in the lower village rather than the great one in town, because Eleanor had asked for it and the Duke had found he could refuse her nothing. The estate passed into the trust the Baron had made, and the tenants kept their farms. And the lower field was drained at last by an engineer the Duke sent for, so that it never flooded again, and the families who had lived on that land for 100 years learned the name of the man who had asked, finally, after their own. Lady Marjorie removed to Bath, where the assertion she had made to the probate court was allowed to rest unprosecuted on the Duke's own intervention, for he had no wish to ruin an old woman, only to displace her, and the Dowager understood the mercy and hated it more than she would have hated a trial, which was perhaps its own kind of justice. The nephew went back to town and his debts. Miss Vane married a baronet within the year and was, by all accounts, content. It was the following winter, with snow falling soft and steady past the tall windows of the house, that was now her home, that Eleanor sat in the library where the Baron had once found her asleep over Cowper, and her husband came and stood behind her chair and put a folded paper into her hands. It was not the will. The will was locked away with Mr. Felton, its work done. This was a single sheet, older, the ink gone brown, and she opened it, and saw the Baron's hand from years before, a letter he had written and never sent, addressed to no one, the private reckoning of a lonely old man. Near the bottom, her own name was in it. He had written that the new maid read Cowper better than his own children ever had, and that God, who took so much, sometimes sent a person late and unlooked for to sit across a table in the lamplight, and that a man should be grateful and say so, and that he had never learned how. The Duke had found it among the papers, and kept it for the right night. Eleanor read it twice. Outside the snow came down on the grounds and the lower field that would never flood again, and the fire moved in the grate, and her husband's hand rested on her shoulder, warm and certain, where a year before only a tray had trembled. She folded the old letter along its old creases and held it in her lap, and she thought of an old man's thin fingers pressing a paper into her palm and telling her to keep it until the house forgot itself. The house had forgotten itself. And then, because she had kept faith with a dying man, and with her own conscience, and at the very last with a cold man's hidden heart, the house had remembered. She set the letter on the small table by the window, where the snow could be its only witness. The candle beside it burned steady and unhurried, the way the field-bound Mourning had burned a year before, and she sat in the warm room in the falling light and was, for the first time since her father died, exactly where she belonged. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, leave a word below and tell me the moment that did it. The snow is still falling, and the candle is still lit, and there is always another letter, waiting to be read.